Hi everyone. In this video today, I want to go over some real-world use cases for ARM deployment scripts or Azure Resource Manager deployment scripts, which is something we can use inside of an ARM template or bicep to run a Azure PowerShell or Azure CLI command or script during that deployment. And we'll get into that in a moment. But before we do, I want to give a big shout out to Derek and Dwayne, who put on an event this year, and they did it last year as well, called Azure Back to School. And this session here is a part of that Azure Back to School event, and this is my talk that I'm submitting for that. So just before we get into it, over here I've got the Azure Back to School website up, and this is the list of sessions for 2022. There'll be links to this in the description below if you want to easily get to this. And look at all of these sessions here. Each one of these are individual sessions that someone has submitted. And this is all running throughout the month of September in 2022. We've got sessions on B2C. We've got looks like some machine learning stuff there, zero trust, confidential computing. There's a bit of everything for everyone in here. And I've had a look through the sessions. There are some fantastic speakers. There's some great sessions. So I'd strongly recommend, if you just stumbled across this video, make sure to go and check out the link for Azure Back to School and check out all of the sessions there. But for now, for me, let's jump into a quick slideshow here. I won't bore you too much with slides. I've got a few slides. We're going to do some whiteboarding. And of course, I've got a bunch of demos as well. So let me bring up the slides here. So as I said, this session is on Azure Resource Manager, and look at that, I can't spell resource. How about that? I'll leave that in. Azure Resource Manager deployment scripts, and these are the real world use cases. So I've got a few scenarios that we're going to go through here of how to use deployment scripts. And my takeaway for you is not these are two specific things that you can do, but it's more so to get you thinking, but what am I doing outside of ARM templates and bicep templates, maybe with a script, maybe in a pipeline, that might work better if I'm able to bring that inside the bicep or ARM template deployment. So the agenda here for today is just to have a review of the ARM deployment script. I'm not going to go into a super amount of detail. There are some great resources out there if you do want to go a bit deeper, but I'll just do a general 5 to 10 minute review. We'll have a look at what it is and what it does. From there, we'll jump into example number 1, which is running a PowerShell script. And I'll talk about the exact example that we're going to go through there. Then we're going to extend that a little bit. And with that PowerShell script, I'm going to be passing through an API key to go and do something in Cloudflare. And when I pass that through in the first time, you're going to see that's going to come through in clear text. So we want to extend that a little bit, and I'll show you how to use secrets in the deployment script to make sure that we're not exposing those secrets if you need them in the script that you're going to run. From there, it's great if we can get rid of any API keys or secrets entirely. So example number 2 is going to be using managed identities. And for that one, we're going to be doing some copying of a Key Vault certificate from one Key Vault to another. And the deployment script, when it runs, is going to use a managed identity to connect into the Key Vaults to do that. So that's what we've got lined up for today. Let's jump into a whiteboard here, and I'll go through the deployment script overview. Okay, let's kick things off here with a good old wonky cloud at the top. So this here is Azure, and you're gonna have to put up with my terrible handwriting throughout this, sorry, but hopefully with me explaining it, you'll get the gist of where we're going. So down here sitting in front of Azure, we of course have Azure Resource Manager or ARM. And then the whole idea that you're probably familiar with down here, if we just draw out, this is we've got either an ARM template, or these days, this could be a bicep file, which is becoming more and more popular over the JSON ARM templates. Doesn't matter for us too much here. That's irrelevant. I'll be using bicep, but if you're still using ARM templates, by all means, you can do this as well. So then in that template, we've got, a bunch of things, parameters, variables, but the important stuff is we've got a resource and we deploy that. And maybe we've got another one here, and we've got a few resources defined. So then what happens is when we're ready to run that or deploy that against Azure, we effectively submit that to Azure Resource Manager, either using PowerShell, Azure CLI, a pipeline, a bunch of different ways you could do that. And then Azure Resource Manager handles the communication with Azure itself to go and deploy those resources. So that might be something like a web app. It could be something like a virtual machine. Maybe we've got some SQL there. Doesn't matter too much for our purposes here. The fact is that resources get defined in an ARM template or a Bicep template, submitted to Azure Resource Manager, and then they go and get spun up inside of Azure. But now the question is, let me just change the color here. Let's go and grab purple. What if we're deploying a bunch of resources and then down here, we want to go and do something that we can't quite do with ARM templates or Bicep templates? Maybe that's something that isn't yet supported in doing that in templates. Maybe it's something we need to do at the data plane level of these resources. So Azure Resource Manager can handle the infrastructure and the deployment, but if we want to go inside to a SQL VM or inside of a storage account and copy some data around or inside of a key vault, not all of that is supported using native ARM templates or Bicep templates. So we're going to need something else here. Now, I just want to sidetrack a little bit. Let me go across to green for this one. Now, you could do this if you were using something like Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions, and let's imagine you had a pipeline. What you could do here is you could kick off your pipeline, and maybe one of the first tasks here is to do a Bicep deployment. So you might spin up a few resources there in Bicep, and then once that Bicep deployment has finished, you might then have another task that comes along, and maybe this run is running some Azure PowerShell. And you're doing something inside of that PowerShell script. You're copying some data around, you're connecting to a SQL database, you're connecting out to a third-party service, whatever it might be. And then at the end of the pipeline, you might have some more stuff that you need to do in Bicep after that PowerShell script or that Azure CLI command has run. So maybe you've got a bunch of stuff that's getting some things ready, but you've got this step in the middle that you need to do and you can't quite do it in templates. So then here at the end, you've got some more Bicep to go and deploy, or ARM templates, doesn't matter. I'll use that interchangeably throughout here. So yes, you could glue this together in a pipeline, and that's absolutely fine. There's no problem with that. But now you need to start thinking about, what am I doing in that PowerShell or Azure CLI, and how much do I need to put in the Bicep templates that are being ran first versus what's being run afterwards. And I need to kind of think about all this logic and how it glues together. And it starts to make my things maybe not so reusable as well if I want to use them across different environments or applications. The other thing to consider with this model as well is that when you're running a pipeline and you run that Azure PowerShell script, you need to consider the identity that that script is running as, because when you're running in GitHub Actions or Azure DevOps, you're running typically as some sort of service principal. In Azure DevOps, that's a service connection, but under the hood, it's effectively a service principal. So that service principal needs access to your Azure subscription to deploy the resources using Bicep, but now it also may need data level access to those resources because you're running that script from that same pipeline, which is using that service principal. So now you might need to give that service principal access to other areas within Azure at that data plane that you didn't necessarily want that specific service principal to have to use. So with using this method of deployment scripts, as we'll build this out, you can use a different identity for running the script versus what you're deploying your resources as. And there are some use cases for where you might want to do that. So back over here with our deployment script, if we go back down to the bottom with our ARM template or our Bicep template, we've got a few resources that we're deploying. And then what we can do in the middle of this is we can actually deploy a deployment script. And a deployment script is an Azure resource. It is something that you can deploy using an ARM template or a Bicep template. And what does this actually do? Well, this guy runs Azure PowerShell, or it can run the Azure CLI. Today, those are the two things that are supported. Maybe some more things will come down the track, but that's what's there right now. And then what you could do in your Bicep template is, so you're deploying resources, storage account, whatever, then you go and run a deployment script to go and do a particular thing, and then you can continue deploying resources down here. So if you've got a modular Bicep template where you're pulling in lots of different things to spin up an entire environment, this can be really, really useful just to have that PowerShell script or Azure CLI script run in the middle of a deployment, just to go and tweak a few things or change some settings or do something over here that you need right in the middle of a deployment. And what happens is when you submit that Bicep template back to ARM, it goes and deploys these resources up here in Azure as expected. And then when it gets to the deployment script is its own resource that gets spun up in Azure. Deploy script. Now, under the hood, what this is actually doing is it's taking your Azure CLI or your Azure PowerShell, and it is running that inside of a container. And that runs in ACI, Azure Container Instances. So it spins up a container, injects your PowerShell or your Azure CLI into that container, runs it, and then depending on what settings you've got, tears it down. And to do this as well, we also do need a file share. So I've got a storage account here. And what happens is automatically when you run the deployment script, it will go and spin up an ACI, an Azure Container Instance, and optionally, it can go and spin up a storage account and it will mount a file share across into ACI. If you've got an existing storage account that you did want to use, you can specify an existing account and it will just go and provision a file share, which it then mounts into ACI. And then your script, like I said, runs inside of ACI, does whatever you've done inside of your script, and then the deployment will move on to these other resources. And the power of this, as you'll see when we get into the demo, is you can start doing things like dependencies. So if you need to do a few things, then run a deployment script, and then do some things after that deployment script has ran, you can just use the native ARM template or bicep methods for doing dependencies within that script file. So if we just go back down to the bottom there, let me change the color again across to orange there. So if we look at this Azure PowerShell or Azure CLI, how do we actually write that? Well, this could be inline. So we can literally write it inside of the bicep template inline to the deployment script resource itself. We could specify a URI out to an external file. Now you need to think about where that file is being hosted, and can Azure Resource Manager at deployment time go and access that file and pull it in, because it obviously needs to read it to be able to pass it through to the Azure Container Instance to run it. Or we could have just a script file, maybe sitting in the same repository where you're running your pipeline and doing your deployment from. Or like I'll do in the demo, I've just got some bicep templates and I've got a PowerShell script file sitting there in the same directory, and we can reference that from the bicep file. So when we go and do the deployment, it reads in that PowerShell script and then passes all of that through to ARM, and ARM takes care of the rest. So what happens up here with the Azure Container Instance, when your script's running, so this might be going and doing things to Azure resources. Like I said, we can give this Azure Container Instance a managed identity, and it can then go and access some of these resources. Maybe you need to change some settings that aren't available in Bicep. Maybe you need to call an API. Maybe you need to do something with the data inside of some of these services. That is all doable. But the other thing is that Azure Container Instance is just a container. So we can have this come and connect out to a third-party API. So if you need to do something that's totally external to Azure, yes, you still need to write some logic and put something together in an Azure PowerShell script or an Azure CLI to go and interact with that third-party API. But you can now start to do things outside of Azure and include it in your deployment. And this use case here is exactly what I've rigged up for our first example. So we're going to be using pretty much everything that I've drawn out here in both of the demos. You'll see an example of all of this kind of working together. So I hope that's given you a good overview. Let's go back into the slides quickly and we'll have a talk through what scenario 1 is going to be. So scenario 1. This is where I want to assign a custom domain and an SSL certificate to an app service without needing to glue something together inside of a pipeline. Now, this is the kicker. My DNS is not hosted in Azure, so I can't use ARM templates to modify a public DNS zone. Now, if your public DNS for your domain was hosted in Azure, yes, you could absolutely do this in a Bicep template or an ARM template without needing to do anything else. You can deploy the web app, go and create the DNS records that you need, and then do the SSL certificate and the custom hostname binding. That's all well and good. But mine is hosted out in Cloudflare, and I can't use Bicep or ARM templates to reach out to Cloudflare. So the typical process for this is to go and deploy an app service, and then you would create a CNAME or a text record in public DNS to validate domain ownership. So sometimes you will just want the text record to be created so that you can go and add custom domains onto an app service or a function app or whatever it might be. Or if you know what it's going to be in advance, you can go and create the CNAME. I'll be using the CNAME today, but this exact same process fits for a text record as well. After that, once we've got that DNS validation in place, we can add the custom domain to the app service. So step number 3, we can't do until we've got step number 2 in place. It will actually go and check the public DNS to make sure one of those records exists. After that, I can configure the SSL certificate on the app service for that custom domain that we added in step number 3. And then finally, we bind the SSL certificate to the custom domain name, and then the app service will start responding on that custom domain name. So here I've highlighted step number 2 of creating the CNAME and text record in public DNS. And that's the part where we're going to use a deployment script in this particular process to go out to Cloudflare, create that DNS record for me, and then everything else should hopefully just work as intended. That's scenario 2. We'll come back to that in just a minute. So let me flick across here. Actually, I want to go into VS Code. And what I want to do briefly here is show you the bicep templates and the PowerShell script that I've got. So I've got a directory here for ARM deployment script examples, and then inside of that, just 2 subdirectories, one for an app service and one for the Key Vault. We'll get to the Key Vault in the next example. So let's focus on the app service for now. And let's start with just the app service.bicep. Let me get rid of that panel there on the left-hand side. And let's just walk through this. I'll be reasonably quick. The part that I want to stop at is the deployment script itself. But if we have a look here, at the top here, I've just got a bunch of parameters there. So I'm looking for the location. This one here now is getting the UTC now time. I'll explain that in just a little bit. We need the custom domain record name. So that's going to be the first part of the custom domain that we'll configure on the app service, and then the custom domain zone name. So in my example, this is going to be mattalford.com, and those 2 together would make up the fully qualified domain name of what you want as your custom domain name. And then because I am reaching out to Cloudflare here, we do need to pass through a Cloudflare API token to the bicep template, which in turn will get passed through to my deployment script. Next down here, I am just creating a variable for the full custom URL. So I'm just taking the custom domain record name and then the custom domain zone name with a period in the middle and doing some string interpolation to get that fully qualified domain name. So as we scroll down here, I'm deploying an app service plan. This is pretty straightforward. I'm just passing through the location. I'm doing a P1 V2 for this one. If you are going to follow along, make sure to keep an eye on the SKUs. Make sure to clean up when you're done so this doesn't cost you a lot of money as well. If I keep going down, next down here, we've got the web application itself. So this is going to be running a Linux container. And I'm just going and getting this Docker image from mcr.microsoft.com. Doesn't matter too much what is going to be running there. I just did want something running. And we're going to run that on the app service plan that we spun up kind of just previously above that. Now, as I keep going down, this is the part that we need to pay some attention to. So this here, this resource, this is a deployment script resource. You can see at the top there, microsoft.resources/deployment scripts. This resource here is the actual script that I want to run in the middle of my bicep template. So I've gone and spun up the app service plan. I've gone and spun up the app service. And now I want to reach out to Cloudflare and go and create that DNS record so that I can do the host name binding and the SSL certificate, so on and so forth. So let's have a look at a few things here. I'm giving it a location, which is where everything's being deployed to using the location parameter. The kind here is Azure PowerShell. So in this use case, I'm using PowerShell. You can set that to Azure CLI as well. And then down here, we've got the different properties. So first of all, we need to specify what version of Azure PowerShell we want to run. Mine was just set to 6.2.1 here because I've had this script for a little while. I think they're up to version 8, maybe even 9 of Azure PowerShell, but there's a whole bunch of versions for both PowerShell and Azure CLI that would be supported. The next property down here are the arguments, and this is a standard PowerShell set of parameters. So I'm passing through the domain zone name here, and for the value of that, I'm passing through a parameter on this bicep template. And then I've got a parameter on my PowerShell script, which we'll have a look at in a moment. I've got a parameter there for record type, and I'm setting that to a CNAME because I want to go and create a CNAME record. And then I've got a parameter called record name, where I'm passing through the first part of the record name. And then let me just move across here. Well, I've then got record value, which is where I'm actually going to the web application that we've deployed just above. I'm getting the properties of that, and I'm getting the default host name. So that is the something.azurewebsites.net default hostname, and that is the value that I want to create for the CNAME record in Cloudflare when we go and create that. And then as I go along here, I've got another parameter for the Cloudflare API token that gets passed into my PowerShell script so it can go and reach out to Cloudflare and actually do the creation that I need of the DNS record. As we look further down here, we've then got the script content, and this is obviously pretty important. So like I said, you could do this inline, and if you wanted to, that's absolutely fine. If you haven't got a complex script, maybe that's what I'd recommend. My personal preference is to try and store the script elsewhere, like in a PS1 file or a shell script that you can then load in. So you can see over here, I'm using this function called load text content, and then I'm referencing new-cloudflare DNS record.ps1, which is a PowerShell script file, which sits in the same directory as this bicep template. So when I deploy this bicep template, it is going to go and load in that PowerShell script, submit it to Azure Resource Manager, which will then end up running in that Azure Container Instance. So that's kind of how that works. But if you wanted to, you can write it inline, and you can reference a URI as well. So if your PowerShell script was hosted somewhere publicly, maybe, you can go and reference that, maybe out on GitHub or whatever endpoint it's on. Then we've got a few things down here that are kind of specific to the deployment script. This first one here is the cleanup preference. And there's a few different properties that we could have here. If I just hover over on success, it should bring up the IntelliSense. Why is that not working for me? There we go. So we can have always, on expiration, or on success. And I had mine set to on success. And what this means is when to clean up the storage account and the container. So like I said, when you run a deployment script, it will go and spin up an Azure Container Instance, and by default, it will spin up a storage account as well. And then your script will run inside of that Azure Container Instance. And this setting here is, what do you want to do when your script has finished? What do you want to do with those resources in terms of cleaning them up? Do you always want to clean them up, no matter if it was a pass or a fail, or a success or fail? Do you want to clean them up on success only, which is what I've got? Or do you want to clean them up on expiration? And I'll explain about expiration now with this next property down, which is retention interval. And this is the interval on how long the service will retain the deployment script resource itself. So we don't necessarily want the deployment script to hang around forever, because when we rerun this bicep template or ARM template, it is probably going to go and run another deployment script. And I'll talk about that in just a moment as to when it will and won't go and rerun. But the retention interval is basically, how long do we want to keep the deployment script? Now, this is based on the ISO 8601 pattern. So the value that I've got here is PT1H, and that basically means the deployment script resource itself will be kept for 1 hour after the deployment. So just to recap that, when you run a deployment script, it will go and provision a deployment script resource. It will then deploy an Azure Container Instance and by default a storage account. So the cleanup preference here is relating to the cleanup preference of the Azure Container Instance and the storage account. The retention interval is related to the retention interval of the Azure deployment script resource itself. So back up here for the cleanup preference, if I set this one to on expiration, for example, then my Azure Container Instance and my storage account would wait around for 1 hour because it is waiting for the expiration of the deployment script itself. So hopefully that makes sense as to what these resources are and how long they're going to hang around for. You may need to play around with these settings just to get it across your head, but I'm going to set that back to on success for now because I don't really need the container instance and the storage account to hang around if everything ran okay. Now this last value here is force update tag. So just to take a step back, we've got a PowerShell script or an Azure CLI set of commands or a script that we want to run in the middle of our deployment. Now by default, you will want to write those to be idempotent because you don't want to rerun these deployment scripts and have it error out. You know, maybe you were going and copying some data or modifying a resource, and if your script tries to rerun that thing and it's already set or it's already done, your script might error, which will then cause the deployment to fail. So you want to have some logic inside of your scripts to do some checking first and be idempotent and be able to be rerun. Now, by default, when you rerun this template, which has got a deployment script in it, the deployment script itself won't actually rerun if you haven't made any changes to the deployment script resource itself in Bicep or any of the arguments or the actual PowerShell or Azure CLI. if you're submitting the same thing, it won't go and rerun. But if you did want it to rerun each time, which is usually how I end up writing my PowerShell scripts for deployment scripts, then you can use this force update tag property. So as it says here, this gets or sets how the deployment script should be forced to execute even if the script resource has not been changed. So we are using the now parameter here, and if I scroll back towards the top, this was just doing a function to get the UTC now timestamp. So that is always going to change when you redeploy. So that's always going to be a different value, which down here passes that into the force update tag, which is going to be different from the last time it was ran, which forces the deployment script to effectively run each time. So depending on what behavior it is that you want, if you only want the deployment script to run if you've actually gone and changed the script contents or the arguments or something like that, that's absolutely fine. You don't need that. I thought I would point that out as a property that you can set as well. So at this point in time, we've got our app service plan deploying, we've got our app service deploying, and now we've got our deployment script, which is going to reach out to Cloudflare, and it's going to go and create a DNS record. Now, I do have the PowerShell script here for new Cloudflare DNS record. I am not going to go through this in detail with you. This will be up on GitHub. I'll link to this in the description below, so you can go and check out this if you want to. But effectively, it is going out to the Cloudflare API using some of those parameters that we're passing through. It's doing some checking here, so there's some if statements and some conditional stuff. But long story short, if the DNS record doesn't already exist out in Azure, then it will go ahead and create it and resolve it to the web app that I'm spinning up. So yeah, go and have a look at that if you want to have a look at the logic in the script, but at a higher level, that's what it's doing there. So underneath that, I'll go through the rest of this pretty quickly. Down here, we've got the hostname binding. So you can see here, I've done a depends on, and I'm making this dependent on the create Cloudflare CNAME record, which was, if I scroll up a little bit, this is the name of our deployment script resource. So I'm now making the hostname binding dependent on our deployment script actually running and succeeding. So what I'm doing here is I'm binding the hostname to the web application. And then down here, I'm using a managed certificate. You could pull in a certificate from Key Vault or something if you wanted to. I didn't want to get too complex with this though. So I'm making this dependent on the hostname binding. We are deploying a managed certificate to that web app. And then finally, I'm then going to go and bind the SSL certificate, that managed certificate that we just provisioned, to the custom hostname that we're now able to put on the web app because we've got our public DNS. So the end result of all of this is that we should have a web application running on a custom domain name for my domain, which is hosted out in Cloudflare. The CNAME record should be deployed and resolving to the Azure web app, and that is all protected with a managed SSL certificate. So with that, let's go and create our Cloudflare API key that we'll need to pass through into this bicep script, and then let's go and test it out. So if I jump over to the web portal here, and I'm already logged into Cloudflare, and just up in the top right here, I'm going to go into my profile, API tokens, and I want to create a new token. Edit DNS is good. I'll just use that template. So the permissions here, now this is obviously going to differ depending on what service you're reaching out to. This is just one example that I've got for Cloudflare. So I want to edit the DNS zone, and let's say just scope that to mattalford.com. We won't do any client IP address filtering or TTL. That's absolutely fine. Let's go ahead and continue, and we'll create that token. Now I'll copy that token out and just paste it over here so I don't lose it. Awesome. Okay, so let's go back into VS Code. And what I'm going to do here is bring up the terminal at the bottom. Let me just make that a bit bigger there, and we'll clear the screen. And I do need to change into this directory and then down into the app service directory. So if I look inside of there, I've got the app service.bicep, which is what we just went through, the bicep deployment. And then in this same directory, I've got the new Cloudflare DNS record PowerShell script. So this is all pretty much ready to go. So you could do this from an Azure pipeline if you're deploying your bicep templates that way. I just wanted to keep this simple, and I'm going to deploy this bicep template using Azure CLI. I've just noticed that bicep template isn't saved there. I don't think I edited too much, so I've just saved that. So let me copy in this command here. So this is reasonably straightforward if you've done an Azure CLI deployment of an ARM template or a bicep template. But just real quick, so we're doing an AZ deployment group create, and we're targeting the resource group named RG deploy script. So I've already got a resource group pre-provisioned with that name. The template file is in this directory, and we're just passing through appservice.bicep. And then we're passing through a couple of parameters. So I'm giving it the location of Australia East. The custom domain record name is Azure Back to School. The custom domain zone name is mattalford.com. So what that means is with some of that concatenation that I was doing is this fully qualified domain name will be azureback2school.mattalford.com. That's what we should be able to browse to. And then I'm passing through the Cloudflare API token here. Now, just a note on the API token. This is obviously in plain text. I'll address that in a few minutes. We won't address it for submitting it to the Bicep deployment itself, but we will address it for the Azure Container instance and passing that through. But more on that to come. So with that, by the way, I've already done an AZ login and an AZ account show to make sure that I'm looking at the right subscription. So I'll hit enter, and with any luck, that deployment will start okay. Look at that, I lied. I said I had a resource group ready called RG deploy script. I think I've actually changed the name of that. Let's have a look here in the Azure portal, RG deployment script. Let me just up arrow there. And the resource group, we want that to be RG deployment script. All right, let's retry that again. Love an error in a live demo, by the way. Great stuff. Okay, so that deployment there is running, so that's a good sign. Let me jump over to the portal here, and we'll have a look at that resource group that we're deploying to, and we can actually have a look at the deployments here. So we can see app service is spinning up there, so that's the name of our deployment. And we can see it's gone and spun up the server farm, which is the app service plan, and this deployment is still in progress. So if I just jump a little bit back to the resource group here, there we go. We can see that the app service plan is there. So let's just keep an eye on this as it goes through. What I want to try and show you is as it's running through, we'll see the deployment script resource, we'll see the Azure Container instance, and we'll see the storage account all spin up as I sit here and do some refreshes. So there we've got our app service, which is running on that app service plan, just called deploy script app 01. And as I refresh again, we've now got the deployment script itself. So that has just got a name of create Cloudflare CNAME record. So as you can see down there under type, that is the deployment script itself, which is a resource inside of Azure. That is not the Azure Container instance or the storage account. If I keep doing a refresh here, we should actually see those spin up in just a few moments. But remember, I had them to set to expire on success. So if this script runs okay, that storage account and that Azure Container instance will only be running there for just a few seconds. There's the storage account there. It is also worth noting that as it is spinning up a storage account and using a tiny bit of storage on there, and it's running some compute inside of ACI, these do cost money to run because you're actually spinning up resources, although it wouldn't be very much. So that's another thing as I refresh there again, and you can now see the container instance. It's probably worth keeping in mind to try and keep your scripts as efficient as possible. That's always a good goal to aim for, but because this is running in compute, you want it to be as efficient as possible because you are paying for that. So let me do another refresh there. So that is running in the background. We've got our Azure Container instance, which should be running our script right now. We've got our storage account, which is where a file share was mounted into that ACI instance for storage for that ACI container. And then we've got our deployment script resource. Now, even if this all works, the deployment script resource I had expiring after 1 hour. So we'll be able to go into the deployment script resource to observe what the inputs were, what the outputs were, did the script work, that sort of thing there. So let me do a refresh there again. That looks like it's still running. So I'll jump over to the deployment. Let's have a look and see how this is going. We've got the app service here. So we can see we have got our app service plan, and then it went and created the app service, and then it's going and doing the deployment script there. So let's just give that a few minutes and we'll see how that goes after a couple of minutes. So far, so good. The deployment script got a green tick there, which is always nice to see. And then we can see the hostname binding has gone and deployed, and now it's onto that certificate. So that's deploying a free managed certificate, from Microsoft against that app service. And that's looking good. So the last thing that it needs to do now is the actual binding of that custom domain name to that SSL certificate. And then with any luck, we should be all good to go. There goes the binding now. And there we go. The deployment is complete. It's got the green tick. That is all looking pretty good. So let's go across to the app service itself and we'll just have a look at what's going on here. So up here in the top right, I can see that the URL is azureBackToSchool.mattorford.com. So that is looking good. Let me go and open that up in a new tab. And hey, look at that. That all works. DNS is resolving. It's going to a default container that I pulled down in the Bicep template. Nothing fancy, of course. We've got our SSL certificate. The connection is secure. If I jump across into Cloudflare, let me just go back to the main portal here. mattorford.com, and let's have a look at DNS. And yep, there it is there. We've got Azure Back to School as a CNAME, which is resolving across to deploy script app01.azurewebsites.net, which is that app service that we just deployed. So that is looking great. And I mean, because it's working, I'm sure the bindings are fine. But if we look at the TLS settings, we've got the hostname there, our custom hostname of azureBackToSchool.mattorford.com. And that is the thing that you can't add, or sorry, over here in custom domains, the custom domain is the thing that you cannot add unless you've got that verification in place, which is either a CNAME or a text record. So that's where this kind of all bolts together. Yes, I could have deployed the web app and then had a pipeline go and run a PowerShell script, which reached out to Cloudflare to create that and then ran the other stuff as another Bicep template. But this allows me to put it all together in one single template. It's really easy to see what's going on and how this all works. So that is looking great. We've got DNS there. That appears to be working. And we've got all the configuration here. And we've got our TLS certificate, which is bound to that hostname as well. Perfect. Let's go back to the resource group here. And what I want to show now, so we don't have the storage account and we don't have the Azure Container Instance, as I said, because that worked. And we told it to delete those resources on success, but we've still got our deployment script, and this will still be here for up to 1 hour after the deployment. There's not a lot that you can do in here, but down there in the logs, we can see that it was executing a script. It shows us some of the output there and some of the parameter values that we passed into that PowerShell script. Over there up on the right-hand side, we can see some information like the start time, the end time. So my script ran for about 2 minutes. We can see some of the information about things like the version and the timeout and when to clean up as well. But over here on the left-hand side, we've also got outputs and then content and inputs. Now under outputs, there'll be nothing there because my script wasn't outputting anything, but you absolutely can output some data from whatever you're running and then choose to reuse that somewhere else. So you might need your script to output something that you then pass back to Bicep and use later on in your Bicep deployment, for example. But for the content and inputs, we can see the arguments at the top there. Now, obviously a downside here is you can see the Cloudflare API token is sitting right there in plain text in the logs here, which isn't great. And then we've got the script content. So it's showing me exactly what was ran, which is my PowerShell script. And that's pretty much it there for the inputs. Now, like I said, having that Cloudflare API token showing right there in the arguments isn't ideal. We can see it here in the logs of the deployment script. I dare say if we go back into the deployment here, let's just have a look at the deployment for the app service and then have a look at the template that was submitted. Now for the parameter itself, I did have Cloudflare API token as a secure parameter. So that is all well and good. But when this span up, I was running that PowerShell script and that would have gone and passed the value through in the PowerShell script as clear text, as we can see when we went and looked at the deployment script there a minute ago. So if you need to handle secrets within your Azure Container Instance for your deployment script, there is a slightly different way of handling that. And let's jump across to VS Code again, where I've actually got an example of this. So we'll get rid of that down the bottom, close down app service, and in this same directory, I've got app service-secure string. Now, let me get rid of those. As I scroll down here, this is pretty much the same from a Bicep perspective, with one difference here in the deployment script resource. And the difference is I'm using this property here for environment variables. And I'm giving the Azure Container Instance an environment variable, and the environment variable name here is going to be Cloudflare API token. And you can have either value or secure value. So if you just had environment values that weren't secrets, you can set those up and you just use name and value. but I want mine to be a secure value. And the secure value is going to be the Cloudflare API token. So Cloudflare API token, if you remember, is a parameter on this bicep template, which is set as being a secure parameter. So from the moment this bicep template gets deployed, it's accepting in the Cloudflare API token as a secure parameter, so it won't be showing that in any of the logs or the deployment information. And then down here, instead of passing it through as a parameter, if you remember last time I had -Cloudflare API token just on the PowerShell script, well, this time I'm now setting it as an environment variable, and I'm setting it as a secure value. So this time when the deployment script runs, and I'll show you this in the portal, we're not going to see the API key there in plain text. This also does mean that I need to make some changes to the PowerShell script as well. So here really quick, if I go back to the original one actually, you'll notice I just had a parameter there for Cloudflare API token, which got set up in the API header. But here I've got this new Cloudflare DNS record secure string. And you'll notice if I scroll down, there's no parameter for the Cloudflare API token. And instead what I'm doing here is I'm referencing an environment variable. So $env : and then the name of the environment variable. That's how you reference it in PowerShell. So what that will do when this script runs inside of Azure Container Instance, it is going to go and look for an environment variable called Cloudflare API token, which my deployment script would have passed through as a secure value. Hopefully that's all making sense. Let's close these down and I'll bring up the terminal again. So let's go and deploy this one here. Let me just get rid of that panel on the left-hand side, clear the screen there. And this time I've got pretty much the same command, and I have to change the name of that resource script because it was actually deployment script. So it is pretty much the same. We're doing another AZ deployment group create. This time we're passing it the template file for app service -secure string because I had those couple of changes where we specify the environment variable. The location's the same. The domain name and the domain record are going to be the same. And I'm still passing in the Cloudflare API token in this Azure CLI command here because I need to actually give it the API token at some point. But if you can imagine if you were deploying this bicep template in a pipeline like Azure DevOps or inside of GitHub Actions, what you could do is store that Cloudflare API token as a Key Vault secret or as a secret inside of Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions. And then when you're running the AZ deployment command in your pipeline, you can then pull in a secret value there, which means at no time throughout the whole process will your Cloudflare API token or whatever secret it is actually get exposed, which is obviously a great thing. But do bear in mind that I still need to pass it in here. And because I didn't want to go down the route of doing pipelines and such, then I'm just passing that in clear text as we run the command there. So let me fire that off. Hopefully that will go and start the deployment again now, and I'll come back when that deployment is finished. Okay, so after just a couple of minutes, that's looking good. I'm here looking at the deployment script resource group, and you can see here that this time the deployment for app service -secure string was ran and succeeded. Took a couple of minutes there. So if I go into the overview and we'll have a look at the resources, again, I don't have a storage account or Azure Container Instance, that's expected. But now if I go into the deployment script, you'll notice that I'm not seeing a parameter there because this time we didn't pass the Cloudflare API key through as a parameter to the PowerShell script. So that's looking good. And this time if I go to the content and the inputs, again, nothing there in the arguments, nothing in the logs. And if I scroll all the way down to the bottom, you actually now see down the bottom, we've got a section for environment variables. So you can come in here to the content and inputs and see what environment variables were being specified when you deployed the deployment script. So we can see there that I've got one called Cloudflare API token. And as expected, there's actually nothing under the value because that was being passed in as a secure environment variable. And we didn't want the value to be here printed in the logs in the Azure portal. But that did all indeed work. I did get some output from the script. If I scroll back up, actually we'll go back to the overview. My script was kind of checking automatically, and if it found a DNS record, actually we can see here, I did have this property or this parameter here called update record, and that for me forces it to be created every time. So we can see it did update the DNS record, which does mean that it did actually connect out to Cloudflare, which tells me that now passing this in as an environment variable did actually work. So if you need to get any secrets or API keys or what have you into your deployment script, go and set them as a secure environment variable in the bicep or the ARM template, and then you need to just modify your script to expect an environment variable rather than having an argument pass through. So that is everything for scenario 1. I know that's gone for a fair while. Hopefully that's made sense. That's everything I wanted for example number 1. Let's go and have a chat about example number 2, which is using managed identities with deployment scripts. Now for scenario 2, this is going to be that I need to copy an SSL certificate from a management key vault into an environment specific key vault to be used by something like front door or CDN. So for example, one of the limitations of the classic front door at least was that if you wanted to integrate it with an SSL certificate from Key Vault, that Key Vault had to be in the same subscription. But one of the patterns from Microsoft with their Azure Landing Zone approach is to deploy different subscriptions for dev, test, and prod and different applications. So if you had a front door sitting in one of those environments, say production, you couldn't easily hook it into a Key Vault unless it was in that same subscription. So you'd need a Key Vault per environment, which is fine. But the problem is that you didn't want to then go and have to create and manage individual SSL certificates that were maybe covering the same wildcard domain name. Maybe you had a URL that was, app-test.domain.com and then app-uat.domain.com. And then you might have had a wildcard certificate covering all of those different names. So what this approach here does is you can store the SSL certificate in a management key vault, which you might have hooked into an external CA, for example, for renewals and such. And then using a deployment script, I can now run a PowerShell script that is going to go and check to see if that certificate exists in the destination key vault. And if it doesn't, that means that maybe I'm spinning up a new environment using a pipeline, or maybe I have renewed the certificate over here and it's not matching the thumbprint, so I need to go and recopy it again. So that is what the PowerShell script in this example will do. And the interesting thing here is that the script needs access to Key Vault to read and write data. So it needs to be able to read from the management Key Vault, and it needs to be able to write to the environment specific Key Vault to go and create the secret and the certificate associated with that as well. So we need to run this using a managed identity. And that's the main purpose of this scenario and this example here, is to show you the managed identity. Now, so I didn't put you through the pain of watching me draw on a whiteboard again. I have done this one in the slides. So this is high level conceptual. It's not exactly what I'll be doing in the scenario. I don't have multiple subscriptions, but conceptually, this is what I'm trying to show here. So we might have a management subscription with a resource group, and over there, we've got a key vault and a certificate inside of that key vault. Then we might be spinning up a dev environment using our infrastructure as code and our bicep. So over there on the right-hand side, we've got a dev subscription, and we've got a resource group over there. Maybe we've got something like front door that we want to hook in using that SSL certificate from the key vault there on the left-hand side. But one of the limitations is you can't go cross subscription. So what we need to do in that dev subscription is spin up a dedicated key vault over there. But now we don't want to go and create a new certificate and have multiple certificates to manage. So we can spin up a managed identity over there in the dev subscription, and then we give that managed identity access to the source and destination key vaults. Again, you can get very granular with this, but on the source, we just need to be able to read secrets and certificates. And on the right-hand side, we need to be able to write the data in. And then what we can do, using our deployment script as part of our infrastructure as code deployment, we can have that run in Azure Container Instances. And this time when the script runs, we can actually associate that with the managed identity. And then by default, when your script runs inside of ACI, it will log on and authenticate as that managed identity. So now anything that that identity has access to, your script running in ACI now has access to as well. So what I'm able to do is reach out to that management group key vault over there on the left-hand side, read the certificate in, and then my script's able to take a copy of that and then go and push a copy of it down into the destination key vault over there on the right-hand side in the dev subscription. So let's go and check that out. We'll have a look at the scripts and then we'll go and run it and take a look. So here in VS Code, I've got the directory there for Key Vault. So before we were looking at App Service, now we've got the Key Vault here. Again, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this PowerShell script here, copy-key vault certificate, is used to copy a certificate, one or more certificates in fact, from a source key vault to a destination key vault. They can be same subscription, different subscriptions. There's some logic checking in here as well to see if the thumbprints match, because if our certificates have the same thumbprint, then we don't need to do a copy again. If they mismatch, then it'll recopy across, or if the certificate doesn't exist in the destination key vault, it will go ahead and do the copy because it assumes that it's not there. Again, that will all be up on GitHub, so have a look at that in your own time if you like. Over here in the bicep file, some things that I want to point out. Let me just get rid of that file explorer on the left-hand side. So what I'm doing here is, first of all, I'm importing the existing source key vault. So the source key vault is something that I've pre-provisioned already. I'll show it to you in the portal in just a moment. I've got a key vault. I've created a self-signed certificate in there, and my key vault is just called KV source deploy script 01. And I'm using the existing keyword here in Bicep just to import that as an existing resource. So that won't go and get deployed. Then what I've got down here is I'm creating a user assigned managed identity. And I'm just calling it keyvault-copy-cert-UMI. And then as we scroll down, the next thing that I'm doing is providing access to the source key vault for that user assigned identity that we just spun up. So we can see here the parent is source key vault, which is that resource that I imported just a few minutes ago. And under the permissions, I'm letting it get certificates and get secrets. So that will give that user assigned identity access to the source key vault to get secrets and permissions, get secrets and certificates. Now, as I scroll down a little bit further, what we've got down here is the deployment of a destination key vault. So this is me spinning up a new key vault in the resource group. So this doesn't exist at the moment. I'm passing in the key vault name with a parameter, some other properties here. Again, the thing of interest here is this access policy. So managed identity is the name of the resource in this same Bicep template of that user assigned identity. So I'm getting the principal ID of that user assigned identity. And for the destination key vault, I'm giving it the all permission against the certificates. So it can do anything at all against certificates in the destination key vault. So at this point in time, we've got our source key vault, which was already pre-existing. We've spun up a user assigned managed identity, which has read access to that source key vault. We're spinning up a new destination key vault in our new subscription, and we're giving the user assigned identity access to write or all access for certificates into that, which includes being able to write. So that's where we're at the moment. If I keep going down here, then we get to the deployment script. And this is relatively similar to before. It's a deployment script resource. We're running Azure PowerShell. The thing of difference is this section here. So now we're specifying this deployment script needs a managed identity when it's running. And the type here is I'm setting it to a user assigned managed identity. And then down here, we're passing in the ID from the managed identity resource that's being created earlier in the Bicep template. So what will happen is when this script gets submitted to Azure Resource Manager and then spins up an Azure Container instance, that container instance will run as that managed identity. And automatically by default, when you set a deployment script to run with a managed identity, it actually does the log on to Azure using that identity without you needing to write it into your script. So you don't actually need to worry about doing an AZ logon or a connect-AZ account or anything like that with the dash identity. It will do that automatically if you're specifying the deployment script to run with a managed identity. And from that, everything else is pretty much the same. We've got some properties down there. Again, I'm loading in the script content for the copy key vault certificate. I'm passing through some different parameters and parameter values. There's no secrets in this one because I've got no API keys or passwords or anything like that. I'm leveraging managed identities and Azure role-based access control, or in this case, key vault access policies, to do the different levels of access so that I can copy the certificate from source to destination. So with that, just before I go and run that, let me fire up the web portal here. And this time I've got a different resource group called rg-deployment script-mi. And over here, as you can see, the only thing that I've got is kv source deploy script 01. So that is my source key vault acting as my management key vault. And inside of certificates there, I've just got a self-signed certificate, mattorford-com. And yeah, like I say, it's self-signed. There's nothing fancy about the certificate itself. That's not too important. It is covering mattorford.com, but it's self-signed and it wouldn't actually work. But imagine that that is a real-world certificate that you need copied from source to destination. So we'll go back to the resource group there. Let's go on over into the console here and I'll clear the screen. And I need to change directory here into the key vault. And I've got the command over here, which I'll just paste in. Again, nothing too fancy. AZ deployment group create against the resource group rg-deployment script-mi. The template file that I'm passing in this time is the managed identity example.bicep with a few parameters. So the location, the name for the destination key vault, and the SSL certificate name that I want to copy from source to destination. So let me press enter and that'll fire that off. And we'll give it a few minutes. I'll go ahead and check in the portal and we'll have a look at the deployment in progress and we'll see how it goes. As I do a refresh there, I can see that I've got my destination key vault has been provisioned and we've got the managed identity there. So if I go into the source key vault and let's have a look at access policies over there. I don't think that access, oh, there we go, on a refresh. So that access policy has come through for the user assigned identity and we can see that it's got permissions to get secrets and to get certificates. So that looks like that's going through okay. Let's do another refresh there. There's the deployment script for copy SSL certificate. And let's just give it a few more minutes. It's still spinning up that script and the Azure Container Instance and the storage account. So we'll check back in just a couple of minutes. There we go. That deployment is complete. We've got the green tick. That is looking great. So let me go across to the resource group. And as expected, we've got 2 key vaults now and the managed identity and the deployment script is still hanging around. So if we have a look at that, that is looking good. It says we've got the provisioning state is succeeded. It's gone and removed the storage account and the container instance because that all worked okay. So if we go back to the resource group and then have a look at the destination key vault. So this is the one that we just provisioned. And I think I've got to add myself in here as having an access policy. So just bear with me here for a moment. And now that I've given myself access, I should be able to go across to certificates. And with any luck, there we go. There is the mattorford-com SSL certificate in the destination key vault that was spun up in that single bicep template, which handled the provisioning of the user assigned identity, access to the source key vault, the deployment script to do the copy of the SSL certificate, so on and so forth. So with that said, those are the 2 examples that I wanted to take you through. The first of all, just showing a deployment script and how it's going to work, especially with a third party using something like an API, and then how to go and secure that API so that we're passing it all the way through to the Azure Container Instance as a secure variable or a secure environment variable in this case. And then the second example there was making use of managed identities, which is becoming more and more common in the Azure infrastructure. I definitely recommend, if you haven't looked too much at managed identities, take a look at it because it saves having to copy around and use API keys and access keys and all sorts of stuff. You can leverage things like key vault access policies, Azure role-based access control, of course, and that sort of thing. Now, like I said, there's some links down below to all of this stuff on GitHub. I've created a repository up there so you can see the scripts, the bicep templates, everything like that. If you do go and follow along, make sure that you come in here like I'm about to right now and actually come and delete these resource groups and the resources when you're finished with them. So I don't want anyone to get billed too many dollars for testing this out. Like I said, ACI and the storage will incur a really small cost, but yeah, it's going to be pretty cheap. Make sure you delete after you're done though, especially with that app service plan if you follow along with that one. Make sure to check out the Azure Back to School event. Big thanks to Derek and Dwayne and all of the speakers who have submitted stuff. I'm really looking forward to September. There's a lot of great stuff there to watch. There'll be links for that below as well to go and have a look at all of the other sessions. And with that, thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been useful. Like I said, my main goal here was to get you thinking about somewhere maybe that you're using PowerShell or Azure CLI to glue some things together at the moment. Maybe you can bring those into deployment scripts and integrate them in with your infrastructure as code deployment, which in my eyes just makes the thing a whole lot more streamlined. It's really easy to understand what's going on and when. You don't have to look over here in bicep templates and then back over here in this pipeline to see what a script's doing and try and bolt that all together. It's very clear and it's very logical. So again, thanks for watching and bye for now.